This is NPR's All Things Considered. I'm Robert Siegel.
And I'm Noah Adams. Human beings speak thousands of languages, but for modern machines, there is one common language. It is digital, a binary language, an unbroken stream of ones and zeros. As part of our occasional series on technology that shaped this century, NPR's David Kestenbaum reports it was this language as much as it was any advance in technology that gave birth to a new generation of machine.
It would be nice to say that binary was invented by a forgotten two-fingered mathematician who needed a system to count his cats. But there are no stories like that. One historian, when asked who invented binary, paused, then said he'd never been asked that question. So here's one perspective from a native speaker.
Da da dit 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 da 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 dit 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 da 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 dit dit da.
Elliot Sivowicz is a historian at the National Museum of American History.
I speak only Morse code in English.
Morse code was invented back in the 1840s. Its dots and dashes were simple so that they could travel long distances without wearing down.
You are essentially sending pulses of energy to a distance circuit, and it's considered a kind of, in a sense, a kind of digital transmission at very low speeds.
Dots, dashes, ones, zeros. It was digital, something fluid like a word chopped into bits. But you could go back even further. The math of ones and zeros is called Boolean, after George Boole, a 19th century intellectual who was trying to apply the rigors of mathematics to solve philosophical and legal questions. Every statement, every clause could be true or false, a 1 or a 0. But for all this early groundwork, digital machines didn't really exist before 1950. In the first half of the century, everything was what engineers call analog. Take a phonograph record, for instance.
If you have a microscope or even a good magnifying glass and you look at a vinyl record, you'll see that the wiggles in the groove of the record get bigger when you have a loud passage of music.
Paul Ceruzzi is a historian at the National Air and Space Museum and author of the book A History of Modern Computing.
There is a direct correspondence, and that's what the word analog means. It's analogous to the sound of the music. There's an analogy between the depth of the groove or the wiggle of the groove and the sound of the music coming out of the loudspeaker.
Take me back to Constantinople, no you can't go back to Constantinople, now it's Istanbul, not Constantinople, why did Constantinople get the works? That's nobody's business but the text.
Analog devices were easy to make, but that wasn't the only reason they dominated. Analog reflected a deeply held belief in how machines should be built.
With the classic electrical engineering, you built a system that somehow mirrored the way you saw the world operating. The world turns on its axis and is smooth, and things move in a very smooth way, and you built electrical systems that somehow mirrored the way the world worked. The digital world is totally different. It's totally artificial.
So when people started to build computers in the 20s and 30s, they were analog. Some actually had gears and wheels in them. In others, electricity ran like a river, over capacitors, through resistors, and the voltage that came out was your answer. But by the early 40s, engineers were toying with something completely alien. Calculators made out of switches that could be on or off, 1 or 0. The number 3 was stored by flipping 2 switches on. The number 4 was 1 switch on, the next 2 off. In the early 60s, the machines took up rooms, but not everyone liked them. Jim Williams is an electrical engineer at Linear Technology in California.
There were a lot of people who were saying, why on earth would you construct this cumbersome system from this cumbersome language of ones and zeros to express even the simplest relationships? You know, you've got to go through this horrible amount of programming to cram everything into ones and zeros. You know, it's a very inarticulate language.
But what could not be denied was that digital machines were more accurate, he says. To do a more precise calculation, you just added more switches. And if you wanted to build nuclear bombs or put a man on the moon, you needed that kind of accuracy. But for many years, engineers like Williams saw the birth of digital as the death of elegance. Williams took a computer course in 1964, where a professor revealed the great inner workings of digital computers to him. When Williams found out that the machines did multiplication by simply adding over and over and over again, he dropped the course. It was just too ugly. Historians identify a variety of turning points when it became clear digital would eventually take over. The invention of the transistor in 1948 was one. Transistors could be used as small, quick switches. But Jim Williams saw defeat elsewhere, in a toy that talked.
Spell angel. Now
The Speak and Spell taught kids how to spell. It was no bigger than a notebook, ran on 4C batteries. It spoke, you spelled, on a clunky keyboard.
You are correct. Next spell lose.
Speak and Spell for me was a defining moment. It hit me like a ton of bricks. And the first time I saw Speak and Spell was in Building 20 at MIT in the early 1970s.
A colleague of Williams marched into a meeting with the squawking box in hand. The engineers were annoyed, gave him dirty looks, but he kept at it, spelling words and letting the machine correct him.
Once everyone in that room began to realize what this thing was doing, the meeting de facto broke up, and we all started playing with this thing.
It was a magic box, Williams says, something from the 21st century. It didn't just add or subtract, it spoke, interacted with you.
If I had been more attuned, more of a visionary, I would have looked at things like four-function calculators and scientific calculators, which had already happened and were just happening, and seen that you could do something like this. But to see it sitting there in front of me, it was like the sky fell. I was astonished at this thing. And in fact, once we all stopped playing with it, we took it downstairs to the lab and opened it up and took the whole thing apart and didn't know a great deal more about it after we took it apart than before.
Because by that time, transistors were microscopic and being packed onto tiny sheets of silicon. The integrated circuit had arrived. Digital computers were small, fast, and flexible. So even though the Speak and Spell was just a bunch of switches, the machine seemed to have come alive.
Hello? Yes? Who's calling, please? Oh, what's it?
Every day, the telephone is used to save lives.
The phone companies started experimenting with digital way back in 1939. Then phones were analog. Like the grooves on a record, the electrical squiggles on the phone line were an exact record of the sound waves going into the mouthpiece. But scientists working on top-secret military communications wanted a way to scramble the signal so it couldn't be intercepted. And they couldn't find a way to do it with an analog signal. Bob Luckey is Vice President of Applied Research at Telcordia Technologies.
The amazing thing about a voice waveform is you can do terrible things to it, and you can still hear intelligible conversation. People would invent these things that would just scramble the signal, like, just take it and put it through like a Cuisinart. And they said, the signal doesn't look anything like it did before. And then you'd listen to it, and somewhere in there you'd hear a voice.
But if you took the wiggly electronic signal of a voice, measured its strength at various points, then you could convert sound to numbers. And numbers could be easily scrambled with math. Some of the first digital communications were during World War II between Winston Churchill in his underground London bunker and Franklin Roosevelt. Here's a top-secret call made with the Norden K06 system in the 1950s.
Yes, K06 equipment operating over a radio circuit from San Francisco to Washington, D.C.
In 1962, phone companies started sending ordinary calls digitally as well. Analog transmissions could be disturbed by electrical storms or noise, but ones and zeros, designated by high voltage or a low voltage on the line, remained just that, ones and zeros. The sound was cleaner, like it is on a compact disc. It took until the early 80s for music to really go digital. On a CD, the ones and zeros for a snip of sound are scattered all over the disc. Duplicate copies are stored as well. As a result, you can drill a small hole in a CD or destroy a few thousand ones and zeros with a fingernail, and it still sounds exactly the same. Exactly.
I think there is the great dream of digitalization, to take messy reality and make it manageable.
John Staudenmeier is a historian of technology at University of Detroit Mercy.
And I'd say that's thousands of years old, the human longing to get some leg up on unpredictability and craziness and messiness and so on.
The lust for a binary world full of definite yes, no, one or zero answers is very strong in all of us, he says. It's just that now we have the technology to indulge it. But we should be careful, Staudenmeier says. By making computers out of switches that can be on or off, we've already made binary the ground rules for all sorts of decisions.
When I'm teaching this stuff in college, one of the things I do with students is I say, you must answer the question in one of the two answers I provide for you. Here's question 1. Are you male or are you irrational? And the second question, are you female or are you emotionally stunted?
That example may seem far-fetched, but people compartmentalize the world this way all the time, Staudenmeier says. Banks use computers to decide whether to give out loans because they want to remove human biases about race or age. But those machines can make mistakes because they ignore important human analog details, he says, like whether a person is trustworthy.
Do I, with my body that runs with molecules and blood and emotions and passions, do I comfortably reside in a world that reduces all of my experience to ones and zeros? No. Do I love the payoff of those algorithms that let me do enormously complicated things rather quickly and easily? Yes. Do I manage the difference between my analog self and the digitalized systems on which I depend? Not as well as I might.
Even what seems to be a symbol of rebellion, the analog wristwatch with hands that sweep around in an apparently smooth circle, is really digital. Open up the back and you'll find a battery and transistors, counting, counting, counting. If you find this binary creep unnerving, there is one bit of consolation. It may be a natural part of the world. Some have speculated that the brain, which neurons fire or don't fire, is partially binary. And many scientists think binary will pop up elsewhere in the universe. Again, historian Paul Ceruzzi.
The binary system of arithmetic is so fundamental to computers that we feel that it's something that is a universal constant in civilization. And for example, the Pioneer 10 spacecraft, which is currently on its way out to distant galaxies, has a plaque on it that's encoded in binary because we feel that any civilization that might find it is going to understand the binary system.
The plaque reveals Earth's location and when the spacecraft was launched, all through dots and dashes representing zeros and ones, the product of a presumably advanced, precise civilization. David Kestenbaum, NPR News, Washington.